Pandora's actor had thrown himself wholeheartedly into his assignment as liaison to the citizens of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. The days and weeks passed, his experiences accumulated and, in his guise as Moman, he had been provided the opportunity to learn a great many things about the people over whom their master ruled, as well as his fellow denizens of Nazarick who assisted in that rule. The vast majority of the natives that had come under Nazarick's dominion were humans, formerly of the kingdom of Riestais. There were also varied populations of non-humans that lived to the north in the Great Forest of Tob. The relatively small and simple tribes of the demi-humans and scattered heteromorphs were relatively easy to manage. They had mostly straightforward traditions, respected strength, and as long as that strength led to provision and security, falling in line was a matter of course. The hundreds of thousands of humans living in the Duchy of Irantal, however, were another matter altogether. A complex snarl of politics, culture and commerce came with their civilization, and reshaping their society would not be as simple as a decisive conquest and the promise of continued existence. Even as Moman, who was a heroic figure who had won their trust and acclaim, his reassurances and bravado came second to their uncertainty and fear. The task was uniquely challenging to the denizens of Nazarick, whose whole existence previously revolved around maintaining and defending the home of the supreme beings. Either they would keep unwelcome guests out, or they would die trying. Even with the overwhelming might of their new sovereign made plain to see, the humans could still not be coaxed out of their fearful state and, with the restrictions their master had placed on the denizens of Nazarick, unjustified measures against them were not an option. Beyond cleaning up the city and clearing out bandits and other harmful elements from the lands, little progress had been made with the humans as a whole. Kani village, which had seen the personal intervention of Iron Zul'Gaun and his servants on multiple occasions, was the sole exception, but they were a single point of data where many thousands more were required, not to mention it was not so much a human village than a demi-human town, now. If the king will not lead, his nobles will not follow. Baroness Zaradnik's matter-of-fact statement from their discussion on the way back from the border had struck him in its profound simplicity. She had perhaps handed him a piece of the far greater puzzle that had been confounding the NPCs of Nazarick ever since their arrival in this strange new world. Their master had gone to great lengths to perform seemingly menial tasks and went about establishing ploys so simple that they made many believe there was some other scheme in play. Rather than ordering a swift and easy conquest of the laughably weak peoples that inhabited the region, every scenario had numerous conditions, a plethora of stipulations which left his servants in a quandary, at times even having them experience the bitter taste of failure. They had been purposely placed in roles that they were ill-equipped to face, and Iron Zul'Gaun only spoke at length about their actions and experiences after the fact. Even in the face of what the NPCs themselves considered unacceptable, he ultimately offered forgiveness and personally shouldered all of the responsibility. The NPCs had been left in a mentally tentative state after each episode, their pride often kicked out from under them, perception and expectation overturned in equal measure. But, had Iron Zul'Gaun actually been acting to lead them? Was everything up to this point a series of exercises devised by their master to prepare them for the challenges ahead? And, if this was true, was their lack of progress and resulting inaction as his subordinates essentially the same as vassals failing to follow after their king? Pandora's actor considered the discussion that had accompanied the young noblewoman's statement. It did indeed basically describe their current situation. As the noble houses of Riestais simply continued to function independently without recognizable guidance from King Ramposa III, the denizens of Nazarick within the Sorcerer's Kingdom even now continued their regular modes of operation. Undead sentinels stood silent vigil at every street corner. Those assigned to maintenance kept the city orderly and clean. Even Albedo, eminently qualified to serve as the central executive of the realm, sat impotently behind a desk waiting for work to do, for information to analyze and act upon. They were all simply holding to their respective duties, waiting for invaders to defend against or preparing for future problems that they were better suited to deal with. It was as if they had all collectively considered the Sorcerer's Kingdom to be a much larger version of Nazarick, but clearly this approach was not working. If everything Iron Zul'Gaun had done so far pointed in the direction that he wished for his servants to go, then they were all unknowingly failing him by not taking his example and lessons to heart. If all his carefully laid efforts went to waste, how would he react? Would he keep trying, or would he simply give up and abandon them like the other supreme beings? Pandora's actor's heart quaked at the mere shadow of that thought. In the end, He concluded that the situation had become untenable and he would need to set things into motion to prevent that most dreaded events. The fact that the pieces that were required to enact his plan had come together all at once made him feel that his role was part of some unknowable grand design, his creator once again its masterful architect. With this reassuring thought, he leaned back into his chair, crossing his arms while he resumed speaking. I had the opportunity to speak at length with the young lady about a great many matters before our return, he said, and I believe we stand to gain by enlisting her cooperation. Contrary to the dramatic stand he had taken just before, his voice returned to its carefully modulated tone. With the invisible pressure released from the room, Albedo quickly recovered and immediately responded. How can you be so sure of this? Her voice was laced with disbelief. A casual afternoon chat on the road is hardly. She immediately swallowed her words as Pandora's actor raised his left hand, tapping a finger against his temple. Of course I can be sure, he replied. I am a doppelganger, after all, the greatest of my kind in Nazarick. The Baroness had no means to resist my power to read her thoughts as she spoke. Never mind that, she didn't even realize that her mind was being read, her responses carefully measured. Seeing the Guardian Overseer's eyes narrow as she sought to find a crack in his defenses, he pressed his attack. It has been nearly a week since we were fully entrusted with the stewardship of our master's new realm. A week with no progress towards restoring nominal operations in this territory. You should know more than any of us what is ultimately required to have the citizens of this nation take the first steps towards their new lives as subjects of the Sorceress Kingdom. You bemoan the dysfunctional nature of its aristocracy, who serve as its administrative machinery beyond the city walls, and how they are useless in the wake of their recent losses. I have identified an asset in the form of this individual that can be employed to help begin the process that has eluded us thus far, yet you continue to wallow in your embittered frustrations. Demiurge has stated that the ultimate goal of our master is world domination, and we all know that we have taken but a tiny first step towards the future our master has envisioned. For the time being, Ein Summer has minimized his interactions with us, keeping mostly to himself, but sooner or later, he will take action again. When that time comes, what accomplishments will we have to display to him in the span he has graciously allotted to us? When he proceeds onwards and reveals to us the next stage of his plans, what will your response be? Ein Summer, wait. Please give us more time. The last, plaintive line was delivered in Albedo's own voice, and she visibly recoiled. Her eyes widened, and her fingers unconsciously moved to press against her lips, as if she could prevent more shameful words from leaving a mouth that was not even her own. The other NPCs turned their attention to the Guardian Overseer with worried expressions. Without exception, their greatest fear was to fail in their service to the last of the supreme beings that remained with them. This, in addition to the relentless advance by Pandora's actor, had mercilessly driven her into a corner. With her pride on the line and little room to maneuver, she turned to the only avenue that would enact the ends that she sought. Very well, then, she said. Let us decide the fate of Baroness Nazarick. With the subject framed in the manner that it was by Pandora's actor, Albedo could not arbitrarily decide to remove what she perceived as an unnecessary complication without losing face in front of the others. Instead, she decided to leverage the opinions of those seated around the audience chamber. In short, it had become a vote. Hidden behind the dark metal visor, the corners of Momon's mouth turned upwards. In truth, the commands of the Guardian Overseer could not normally be opposed by the denizens of Nazarick. She had been created to hold authority over them, after all, but by exploiting her pride, he had achieved his objective. Sabos was the first to speak, rising to present his views. I believe there is much to be gained by working with the citizens of this nation, he said in a stiff, formal voice. In my own travels, I have seen that these humans can range widely in character, but to preemptively remove one without investigating their potential would be to squander the fruits of Ein Summer's efforts. His response was to be expected, given his benevolent nature. With nothing more to say, he once again took his seat. These humans have bowed, yet they still do not serve. No leniency should be granted to threats from their kind, no matter how insignificant. Kokaitis' stern response once again tied the vote. In his own rule, over the regions surrounding the Great Lake, he had been forbidden from using fear as a motivator, but it was still a rather straightforward power relationship. His view on the matter was equally so. All eyes turned to the final guardian seated in the hall. "It should be fine to see if she proves useful," Shaltier's voice chimed lightly through the chamber, "should it not, Duarantsuka?" The triumphant smile that was slowly forming on Albedo's face vanished. She had obviously expected a ruthless response from the most powerful of the Floor Guardians. Seeing her reaction, Shaltir Bloodfallen quickly continued to speak. "Securing the entire area and its borders barely took our forces a day," she reasoned. "Beyond that, we've basically just been sitting around, aren't you? We should have something to show for our time when Ein Summer moves again. If this human is a way to do this, then we should use her." "A human with true sight is too great of a liability," Albedo said. "She would pose a risk on so many levels that I don't even want to consider what she could inadvertently unravel with her ability." "Then I shall take personal responsibility for this child," Shaltir replied. "If she causes any major problems, I can just immediately dispose of her." "You?" Albedo responded suspiciously as her eyes narrowed, clearly skeptical of the vampire's uncharacteristic interest. "Yes," Shaltir confirmed. "Besides, Ein Summer may still be interested in the unique and strange abilities used by the people of this world. If she is of a strong bloodline, she may be able to perform those martial arts as well at some point, yes? I believe I was tasked to collect these sorts." "Shame." Albedo's low voice was barely audible. Have you no shame?" The demon's words rose in volume, until they lashed out in accusation. "You, who has not produced any of your own results. Desperately clinging to past duties in some reprehensible, selfish desire to absolve yourself of your own failure." The NPCs around the chamber collectively flinched. Though the event in question had occurred many months ago, its fearful specter still lurked in the dark corners of each one of their thoughts. Shaltir's fatal blunder had been dealt with personally by Ein Zul'Gaun. Though he had absolved her of guilt and personally held himself accountable, Albedo's assault had shaken even the most stalwart of those in the room. The word failure struck like the sound of a gavel landing before a soul condemned. While the others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, Shaltir's entire profile crumbled, her veil of relaxed composure falling away all at once. Cringing away from the Guardian Overseer's reprimand, her face became tearful, cheeks flushed, mouth working silently in shock. Her slim, delicate hands rose, making motions as if to touch her face or cradle her head, but she seemed so disgusted with herself that she could not bear to do so. Her voice choked as she struggled to find the words to defend herself. Pandora's actor held out his palms in a placating gesture as he spoke in a calm voice to intercede on behalf of the Guardian who was wrestling with her own shame and self-loathing. "Ma, don't be like this, Albedo," he said in mollifying tones. "Frustrations have understandably mounted over the lack of progress with the humans, but again you have my reassurances that Baroness Saradnik will be of tangible benefit in at least a few areas. She has a character that appears to value duty and order above all else. She will carry out her noble obligations to both land and liege, regardless of who it may be. If we place her safely under Shaltir's authority, I believe the young noblewoman will be able to serve faithfully even as she adjusts to her new reality." He had expectations for additional fruit to be born out of this arrangement, but kept those thoughts to himself out of fear of altering the momentum of the discussion. There would be the chance to nurture future outcomes at a later point in time. For now he needed to ensure that the current resolution made it out of the door of the council chamber. He messaged Yuri Alpha, whom he had preemptively stationed to be nearby to the young noblewoman after their arrival, to retrieve Baroness Saradnik. "Very well then," Albedo spoke once again. Her voice had regained its calm, imperious tone. "If that is what you wish for, then we'll see just how far you can go with this human." Turning towards Shaltir, who was still drying her tears, the Guardian Overseer spoke down from the raised dais. "Shaltir Bloodfallen," she declared, "responsibility for Baroness Saradnik lies solely with you. Any assistance she requires, be it in regards to resources, labor or advice in her civil duties, rests squarely upon your shoulders. Similarly, any problems that arise from your new charge will reflect equally on you. Pray that she does nothing to bring shame to the name of the Supreme One." The Guardian Overseer had probably chosen to wash her hands clean of the entire affair, preferring to withdraw from the discussion rather than pursue the matter and fall into whatever other traps Pandora's actor had laid out in advance. Shaltir, cast adrift with her new acquisition, sat deep in thought while biting her thumb. One could almost imagine the steam rising off of her head as she attempted to figure out what to do with the young noblewoman she had yet to even meet. "We've wasted enough time on this." Albedo had returned entirely to the pristine, unruffled appearance from the beginning of the meeting. "Let us proceed on to other matters." Gathering the documents that lay scattered in a loose pile before her, Albedo mentally reviewed the events of the day's meeting. Beyond the matter of Baroness Saradnik, it had been much the same as the ones that had preceded it. Schultia, having mostly regained her composure, excused herself from the chamber as soon as the session had run out of topics to cover, effectively adjourning the gathering. With the collected articles arranged to her satisfaction, Albedo lightly tapped the papers on the desk to align them before slipping them into a dark folder and placing them into her inventory. She did not rise to leave, instead watching as the others slowly left the chamber through various means. After Schultia left through the main doors, Cocytus teleported away with Entama while Pandora's actor and Sabos were discussing something as they left through the service entrance. Following Momon's figure with her gaze until he disappeared around the curtain obscuring the side door, she thought back to Pandora's actor's unexpected actions. Not only had Albedo been caught completely unaware, she had been completely defenseless against his motion to create a place for a seemingly problematic human noblewoman. With how smoothly the entire discourse had gone in his favor, she suspected that he had carefully calculated the trajectory of the discussion long before the subject was even broached. As the one who was created to oversee and manage the great tomb of Nazarick, she did not enjoy the fact that matters had been wrested out of her control. In her mind, this was a right reserved for her master alone. Previously, her experiences with the doppelganger had been limited to their brief introduction in the guild treasury and a few other interactions. Despite his usually flamboyant and exaggerated character, she held the vague understanding that Momonga Summer's creation possessed an intellect that rivaled both that of Demiurge and her own, though in what manner she had not been even remotely aware of until now. It was reassuring to have another eminently capable individual to serve with, yet at the same time he would be an implacable thorn in her side should he ever choose to oppose her. Fortunately, she had come to this realization before any attempt to incorporate him into her side project. He had laid out a compelling case to allow the Baroness continued existence, and Albedo's pride as a supremely capable administrator would not allow her to deny any of his observations regarding the state of Irantal and its duchy. Shortly after the Baharuth Emperor's audience in Nazarick and the plans to annex Irantal through the seasonal conflict between the two nations had been laid out, Albedo had started her own preparations for the inevitable outcome. Through the weeks leading up to the conflict, she had made a great study of the city and its surrounding lands in order to ensure a seamless transition to Nazarick's rule. She had even taken it upon herself to requisition and personally train suitable undead servitors to act as assistants for the initial phases of the takeover. All of her advance effort had seemingly been for naught, however, as many of the surviving nobles and the officials who served under Lord Rettenmuir had fled to Riestais while the formalities of the annexation were still being observed. So complete was their loyalty to the man, who at the time had served as the city's mayor and Ramposa's provost in the duchy at large, that when he had returned to his own territories in the west, all of his administrative staff in the city had chosen to follow him rather than stay to continue their service in Irantal. As loyal vassals of Momonga Summer themselves, the act of solidarity by Rettenmuir and his associates in loyalty to their own liege had earned them the tiniest modicum of respect by the NPCs, but there was no denying the problems they had caused in their wake. The result was that the Sorceress Kingdom had inherited a district of hastily abandoned government buildings, destroyed archives and the shattered remains of Irantal's aristocracy. She had predicted that it would take several weeks for the elder liches to learn how to adapt their training to these vacant offices, but it turned out that they would not even get a chance to do that. Trade had ceased entirely, the remaining nobles were still recovering from their bereavement, and it was not even known whether those that were left were capable of running their own fiefs. With no data available, and none being collected and filed to process, no projections could be made and no amendments to laws or new policies could be responsibly enacted. Thus the entire administrative framework of the Sorceress Kingdom had run into an unyielding wall from day one. Their only saving grace was that the vast stores of Irantal, filled with supplies originally meant for the armies of Riestais, would serve as a lifeline for the city's population for several months. However, if regular operations and commerce could not be restored by that point, the citizens would run out of vital supplies. While it was possible to use Dada's cauldron to supplement food to an extent, it did not solve any of the other shortages, and went against the idea that the duchy was supposed to be a productive source of income for Nazarick. It was a small thing to provide some food to a single village or town, like they had done with Carney Village and the consolidated Lizardman tribes, but feeding the hundreds of thousands of humans remaining in the Duchy of Eranthal was another matter entirely. One might argue that Pandora's actor had made a rather unfair argument in light of the circumstances, but Albedo also knew that his points were irrevocably true. Excuses had no place in Nazarick, and Eranthal's continued state of paralysis was absolutely unacceptable. The arrangement orchestrated by the doppelganger was acceptable for the time being. She would stay apprised of the Baroness' activities and take advantage of any developments that occurred as a result of them. She did not even care overly much that any of the noble's accomplishments might be accredited to Shiltir. It was imperative that the Sorceress Kingdom achieve a semblance of function as quickly as possible. And if Baroness Zaradnik met with too much success, Albedo could always act to suppress her. Satisfied that the situation was well in hand, the Guardian Overseer looked up from her thoughts to see that nearly all of the NPCs had vacated the chamber. The sole occupant other than herself was Nabril, still standing along the wall where she had attended the entire council session. While all of Nazarick's creations were unified in their purpose to serve the Supreme Beings, the months that had passed in this new world had seen the rise of several factions from within its ranks. Rather than any particular agenda, they had formed out of the general attitudes carried by the various denizens of the Great Tomb of Nazarick. There were three main groups. Two were led by Albedo and Shiltir, which could be loosely categorized by whether their members saw outsiders as either vermin or food. Those who saw vermin as food, such as Entama, did not belong to either side. Their members also supported their respective heads in the ongoing bid for Momonga's attentions. The final group consisted of those denizens that had a more benevolent outlook towards outsiders. It actually had a fair number of prominent members, though none of them held active roles in the direct leadership of Nazarick. In addition, many of the other NPCs, Demiurge, Cocytus, Aura, and Mare, to name a handful, either purposely stayed out of these divisions or remained blithely unaware of them. The Pleiades, the formation of battle maids who included Yuri Alpha, Nabril Gamma and Entama Vassalizer Zeta as a part of their number, were divided in their support for each group, but Nabril was firmly in Albedo's camp. After taking one last look around the empty room, Albedo focused her attention on Nabril. True sight is the nemesis of doppelgangers. Albedo's voice was soft, but still carried clearly across the room to where Nabril stood. I'm surprised you didn't dispose of her immediately. Nabril's lips drew into a thin line. Though Albedo had taken a conversational tone with the battle maid, the doppelganger battle maid bowed in apology before speaking. As soon as I found out, she said, I attacked with enough force to kill her several times over, but Pandora's actor intercepted my spell. Where was this? In the gardens near the front of the royal villa, Nabril replied. We had just stepped off the gazebo cordoned off for teleportation when he informed me of her talent. I see. Albedo tapped a finger idly on her desk. Once again, she was made to realize that Pandora's actor had already been several steps ahead of her by the time he made his entrance to the council chamber. Nabril's appearance as an adventurer left her reliant on her shape-shifting ability, in combination with the ring of non-detection, to conceal her true nature, so Pandora's actor must have immediately perceived the human's reaction to the doppelganger's inhuman appearance. But rather than informing Nabril, whose single racial level in doppelganger meant that she had no ability to sense the thoughts of those around her, he had purposely withheld the information while continuing to test Baroness Zaradnik's character and discern her value to the Sorcerer's Kingdom. It was only after they had arrived in the central courtyard of Eranthal that her talent was disclosed to Nabril, who had in turn reacted appropriately to end the threat. By standing in defense of the Baroness, Pandora's actor had demonstrated to her the dangers of revealing her ability, wordlessly declared to anyone that might be watching that she was under his protection and reminded the denizens of Nazarick that potential threats could still be lurking right under their noses, reinforcing their vigilance. The fact that he had done so without even waiting for the outcome of the council meeting was particularly irksome. It suggested that he had plotted out the course of events and that the result was inevitable. His scheme was annoyingly well crafted. Perhaps he had acted on some secret impetus from their master. Albedo sighed. There was no use in wasting energy thinking about it. Instead, She inquired further as to the Baroness' circumstances. "Human aristocrats do not exist without people to lord over," she said. "Was anyone else present to witness this episode in her territory?" Narbril shook her head in response. "She was alone in her home when we arrived," she replied. "The village and surroundings were empty. The Baroness informed us that the commoners had fled south to the slain theocracy upon hearing about the rout at Katza Plains, abandoning their liege." The maid's lips thinned in disgust as the last of the words left her mouth. Albedo blinked as the words registered in her head. They had abandoned their master? The reprehensible thought caused bile to rise in her throat. Stepping out from behind her desk, Albedo made her way down to the central area of the council chamber, where the large oak table filled most of the floor. A giant map of the lands surrounding Irantal, far superior to those which they had procured from the remains of the city archive, was spread out over most of its surface. Albedo circled around it until she stood over the southwestern corner, tracing her fingers from where Warden's Vale lay, through the wilderness and over the border of the theocracy along the fastest probable route. Nearly half of the population of humans amongst the rural population of the Duchy of Irantal had fled after news of their kingdom's catastrophic defeat at Katza. Waves of fear and panic swept across the lands, often emptying rural communities wholesale. Since the people had mostly fled west to Riastais, Nazarick's hands had been tied as their master's orders forbade them from applying forceful methods to the regions held by neighboring nations. Deploying Moment to try and curb the massive outflow of refugees had been their most effective course of action, but even as he sped from village to assuage the fears of the citizens, more had slipped across the border like so many grains of sand through their fingers. Fleeing south, however, was a different story entirely. The eastern extremes of the Abelian wilderness occupied the space between the southwestern border of the Sorceress Kingdom and the northern border of the slain theocracy. The wildlands were unclaimed by any nation, with next to no development and occupied only by small pockets of demi-human tribes. A simple calculation led to the conclusion that a refugee caravan filled with humans of all ages could not possibly have crossed the wilderness yet, even if they had started their journey shortly after receiving news of the kingdom's defeat. There is no forgiveness for betrayal. Albedo's icy decree required no interpretation. With a sharp affirmative and a respectful bow, Narbril Gamma strode to the main exit of the council chamber, the sound of her armored heels echoing in grim cadence. The pristine smile returned to Albedo's lips. Perhaps there was some satisfaction to be had at the end of this, after all. Bohadant shivered as the cold northern winds buffeted the procession of villagers making their way across the wilderness. It was 8 hours since they had broken camp, with the caravan finally finding a suitable ford to cross the river's rushing waters a few days previous. All things considered, their journey was progressing well. The supplies organized by Baroness Zaradnik had even accounted for possible delays in their journey, so the people were well provisioned, well fed and in high spirits despite the situation that drove them forward. They were now scaling the main pass that rose out of the upper reaches, which would lead back down into the lands of the slain theocracy on the other side. The last snows of winter had left a white blanket over the higher elevations of the surrounding peaks. Even halfway up the pass, a crust of unmelted ice still caked the ground. A few of the village's rangers were blazing the trail up ahead, but the going was now much slower than when they had been following the river along the floor of the basin. The old cleric paused at the side of the newly recleared trail, leaning against a boulder to catch his breath. Though his newfound purpose had filled him with the will to see this duty through, his elderly frame complained with every step of the ascent. He raised his free hand and smiled warmly to the families passing him who, reassured by the priest they had known for all their lives, smiled and waved in return as they continued to trudge resolutely up the slope. Looking down to the northwest, there were still a dozen families following behind. On the horizon, the afternoon sun had dipped to the edge of the opposite side of the valley, bathing the hillside in its fiery light as it fought to melt away the stubborn remnants of winter. Camp would need to be made before the summit of the pass and the transit would continue the next day. It would be a cold night, but nothing beyond the tolerance of the resilient villagers. With the border perhaps not 2 or 3 nights away, he had been mentally reviewing what he remembered of his youth in the theocracy. The customs and behaviors of his homeland seemed a lifetime ago, and he supposed that it was. He had lived for close to a century as the missionary to Warden's Vale, and he felt far more a frontiersman than the young man of his hazy memories, born and raised in the distant cities to the south. Laurel Dale Race. I am Laurel Dale Race. Even the recollection of his own name seemed foreign. Bohadan was a name he had adopted to help him fit in with the hardy pioneers of the Riestises frontier, the name he had used for the vast majority of his life. Though it would be difficult to become accustomed to his birth name again, he needed every advantage he could obtain to find a new place for the villagers turned refugees. He supposed that most would be able to find work easily as sentries for towns and villages. Frontier folk were quite well trained when it came to being able to fight and survive in the wilds of the borderlands. Though they considered themselves humble farmers and woodsmen, they were distinct from the common folk of the more peaceful inland territories. By the age of 30, their time patrolling the frontier and experience in dealing with minor incursions of bandits, demi-humans and monsters would make them superior to hardened members of the average city militia. It was also due to this robust lifestyle that they weathered the yearly confrontation with the Empire far better than the inexperienced levies of other nobles, developing a notable martial identity in the eyes of the other commoners of the kingdom that stood beside them. As his thoughts wandered, he eventually realized that he had rested for too long and the last few families were about to catch up. Gripping the staff that he had brought along with him from the village, he pulled himself back up. After dusting off the scapula draped over his priestly robes, he stepped back onto the path. He paused to take one more look down the trail for stragglers, and froze. Bohadan thought he saw something pass in front of the setting sun. He shielded his vision against the glare, trying to decide what it was. In his advanced age, he prided himself on his exceptional sense of eyesight, which had not faded in the slightest over the years. Continuing to peer to the west, he tried to spot whatever had caught his attention. As he looked to the horizon, a flash of incandescent blue light exploded on the trail not 50 meters below him. The crackle of electricity caused him to duck instinctively. Crouched on the ground, he saw a dark figure skim over the treetops like a swallow darting through the skies. His gaze followed after it. The figure reached the head of the column roughly 200 meters ahead, dropping another scintillating sphere of electricity into the midst of those at the front of the group. Caught unawares, the villagers had no time to react, nor to scream as they were struck down from above. Before cries of alarm from those that witnessed what had occurred were raised, the flying assailant disappeared over the treetops without a sound. With chaos rising from behind and in front, the procession ground to a halt. A few of the villagers readied their bows, understanding they were being attacked, but they were unable to locate the caster that had ambushed them from the sky. Others rushed forward to see what they could do for those that had been bombarded by the spheres of lightning. A moan not 3 meters away jarred Bohadan from his stunned silence. Looking down, he saw a woman horribly burned by electricity from the first explosion, but still barely alive. Crawling forward on all fours, he laid his hands on her and cast a spell. Middle Cure Wounds. Divine power flowed through his touch, glowing softly as it mended the heavy injuries that the woman had suffered. He considered how many had been hit by the first 2 attacks, coming to the grim realization that he did not have enough mana to heal everyone. Scanning the path and its trail of charred and steaming corpses, he scuttled from body to body, trying to reach anyone he could save before they succumbed from their injuries. A fresh cry of alarm from the head of the trail stole away his attention. There. Southwest, up the trail. Lightning. The voice of a woman echoed off the mountainside, followed by a crackling bolt which arced down and surged through the hapless villagers. In the midst of reacting to the opening assault, they were still arranged single and double file following the trail, and the spell cut them down mercilessly. Without even pausing to survey her handiwork, the unknown caster flew off again, gaining altitude before once again vanishing over the treetops. Several villagers that had not been in the line of fire released arrows at the retreating figure from their longbows, but the missiles fell woefully short of their target. As the survivors restlessly scanned the skies overhead, Bohadan scrambled forward, shouting to gain the attention of the others. "We can't stay on the trail. Get into the trees. Find cover." The remaining villagers began to duck into the thickly forested slope alongside the trail, but the caster once again appeared over the tree line. Bohadan saw an arm stretch out, pointing at one of the villagers that was still running off the trail after the others. Maximize magic, chain dragon lightning. A tremendous bolt of lightning, as thick as a tree trunk, lanced out from the caster's hand and struck the fleeing villager. The poor man was instantly reduced to ash, but the spell did not stop there. The arc of electricity coursed around the trees, leaping from target to target as the villagers' attempts to hide were proven to be in utter vain. An eerie silence rose from where there had been panicked rustling in the undergrowth seconds before. Bohdan scrambled around throughout the attack trying to find survivors to heal, but every time their attacker reappeared, the overwhelming force of the spells leveled against them created even more casualties. Most of the villagers now lay dead, strewn over the trail. He would follow the cries of the few injured that somehow survived the devastating assaults, but every time he reached one villager and healed them, a dozen others would die. His continuous healing drained away his mana at an unsustainable rate, yet he doggedly continued to try to save who he could. However, at the last spell that their attacker had cast, he stopped. Up until this point, he had at least recognized the spells being wielded as arcane magic of the third tier: fly, electrosphere, lightning. This last one, however, he had never even heard of in over the century of his life. He could even identify fifth-tier spells. Just how powerful was this spellcaster? For what reason had this individual, who was surely as formidable as the legends of old, come out into the middle of the wilderness to sow such senseless devastation upon a caravan of civilian refugees? As his soul screamed out at the injustice, the dark figure once again appeared over the trail. This time, she came to a stop roughly near the middle of the trail of carnage, and Bohdan finally got a closer look at her. She was dressed in what looked to be a maid uniform, save for several sections of armor that overlaid various parts of her outfit. Black hair trailed in a flowing ponytail behind her as she surveyed the suffering she had wrought. Standing out in the open on the trail, Bohdan leaned on his staff, wondering why he had not yet been struck down. Surely she had noticed him scurrying below trying to heal the injured. She abruptly rose further in the air, and the sudden movement caused something to stir below her. Bohdan looked to the forest floor directly beneath the caster flying overhead and realized what was there. After the first few attacks landed, the villagers had rearranged themselves the same way they would have during a raid on their homes, those capable of fighting fanning out defensively around those who could not. In the middle of the trail, the youngest had gathered at the safest spot in their formation. When Bohdan shouted out to escape into the forest, they had moved as well. From the copse of trees that the caster was now floating over, Sophia's distraught face looked out at him. She had gathered the children to hide in a portion of thick undergrowth. A look of abject horror crept onto Bohdan's face as he looked back up to the caster in the maid uniform. This time, she was looking back directly at him, lips parted in a malevolent smile. There was no doubt in his mind that she knew what lay below her. No. The old cleric's feet drove him forward of their own volition. No. His shaky, tired voice called up hoarsely. The maid continued her slow ascent, spreading her arms wide. No. No, 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 no. Oh gods, please no. Bohdan cried out desperately from the depths of his heart, but she remained indifferent to his pleas. An arrow shot up through the undergrowth, bouncing harmlessly off of her armored skirts. The remaining villagers hiding in the trees had also heard Bohdan's hoarse shouting, soon picking up on the source of the cleric's distress. Several more arrows came up through the trees, pelting the maid with no more effect than the first. Others shouted defiantly, trying to distract her from the helpless children below. To each, she answered with a bolt of electricity, tracking every voice, every arrow back to its owner and frying them where they stood. After several moments of ghastly silence, she seemed satisfied that her ploy had revealed all of the remaining villagers and held out her hand, palm facing upwards. Maximize magic, electrosphere. The terrible orb of electricity once again formed over her hand. Slowly turning her palm over, she let her spell fall to the ground below. Heartbroken, Bohdan fell to his knees and turned his head away, unable to bear witness to the result, but no matter where he turned to look, the bodies of his congregation lay sprawled in death. The acrid odor of charred meat and ashes filled the air. He felt tears flowing freely down his weathered cheeks, but he lacked the will or strength to sob. A shadow crossed over him, and Bohdan looked up weakly. The caster had finally landed. Before him stood the most beautiful woman he had ever laid eyes upon. The impression was lost on him, though, after so much death and devastation, he had become numb to such things. In the cold beauty and sharp expression that many would surely stir the hearts of many to awe and admiration, He only saw a heartless killer with a ruthlessly callous glint in her eyes. As she took a step towards the cleric, a woman suddenly burst out of the bushes behind her, long dagger in hand. She had appeared at a run, launching herself forward in a rage over their attacker's senseless cruelty. Her furious shout rose as she closed with the target of her vengeance. Bohdan's breath caught in his throat, daring to hope. Arcane casters often had poor close combat ability, foregoing martial training for magical study. The maid, however, showed no sign of surprise, calmly sidestepping the woman's charge and kicking her feet out from under her as she hurtled by. The villager stumbled and fell forward with a grunt at Bohdan's feet, blade flying from her hands. As she attempted to recover, the maid's armored heel pressed into her back, forcing her into the ground again. Bohdan knew the woman, a seasoned ranger in her prime, but she was struggling with all her might to rise to no avail. With a smooth, practiced motion, the maid raised her hand and a long, bladed staff materialized in her grasp. She swiftly jabbed down into the back of the woman's neck, blade severing her spine and appearing out of her throat. The struggling ceased, replaced by a feeble, gurgling noise as the ranger lay powerless on the rocky trail. With her would-be ambusher neutralized, the maid turned her attention back to Bohdan. Coming to a stop before him, she reached out with an armored gauntlet to grasp his shoulder. Mana spent, spirit shattered, Bohdan remained on his knees, unable to act upon his grief. The maid opened her mouth to cast a spell. "My lord, I am so sorry." Bohdan reached out in mournful remorse to the spirit of the frontier noble that had seized his imagination and crystallized his conviction, a distant lifetime ago. Maximize magic, shocking grasp. Tendrils of writhing electricity coursed down the caster's arm, through her grip and into the defeated cleric. His body jolted at the shock, and started to steam. Withered flesh began to char at the extremities, rolling up his legs and arms. The burns rapidly reached his torso, the portion of his shoulder held up by the woman broke away. The rest of his body collapsed to the ground in a pile of charcoal and ash. In the stillness that followed, only the cold northern winds continued to blow, sweeping over the caravan of charred corpses. Nabrul Gamma closed her first and the remains of Bohdan's shoulder crumbled, filtering through her fingers into the air. Her gaze turned up the pass to follow the ashes as the wind carried them up and over the ridge and into the lands beyond. Your gods mean nothing to me, insect. Character Dossier, Laureldale Race. Laureldale Race, or Bohdan, as he was known locally to the inhabitants of Warden's Vale, was born in the southern cities of the slain theocracy 119 years before the founding of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. The second son of a common warehouse clerk and a seamstress, he was brought up in a meager household, destined to follow in his father's footsteps as an apprentice. His fate was changed when a shift occurred in the policies of the slain theocracy as its leadership began preparations for the next wave of players, directing their various institutions to expand recruitment, education and training. Bohdan was swept up as his generation was readied for what may have come. Joining the ranks of the priesthood as an acolyte, Laurel experienced a curriculum that not only included the theocracy's stringent training, but also studied events related to player waves, notably those of the 8 Greed Kings, the 13 heroes and the 6 great gods of the slain theocracy. The vast majority of this generation never realized what they were being prepared for. Though his tenure as an acolyte was meant to gird him for those coming times, he ultimately found his calling elsewhere. To the north, the call of a burgeoning human civilization pulled the young Laurel away from his homeland to answer the growing need for priests and missionaries to both aid the growth of human realms and spread the faith of the 6 great gods. At the age of 18, in his search for a place to serve humanity, he encountered Andrzej Zarodnik. The intrepid ranger captured both his admiration and respect, and Laurel would settle in Warden's Vale, serving the barony faithfully as its priest for 4 generations. After receiving news of the Riesti's defeat at the Battle of Katza Plains, Bohdan headed the flight of the residents of Warden's Vale, meaning to lead them to the safety of the slain theocracy. He, along with those who followed him, vanished sometime later in the wilderness while en route to their destination.